In this module, we'll consider some typical perceptions and reactions that global scale cultures have towards local scale cultures, particularly surrounding natural resources and their management. We'll also examine some relationships that can develop as a result of these perceptions and reactions. We'll examine briefly how these played out on the Navajo Nation with regard to livestock reduction, and we'll consider some legislation that now allows tribes in the United States to assume the provision of services on their reservations and some of the difficulties they encounter with this process. Throughout the globalized world, natural resources have been allocated along patterns of power. There are some examples of resources that are maintained by indigenous people who have relatively small amounts of power in the globalized world. These are usually in really difficult to reach areas where the value of the resources is offset by the difficulty in extracting them, or where the value of the resources has only been recently recognized and is now at risk for appropriation. Some examples of the latter are the Yanomamo Reservation in Brazil and the Bushman community of Gope in the Kalahari Desert, both of which have recently had diamonds discovered on the land. The photos on this slide provide an example from the Caribbean. This is the Tobago Keys Marine Park in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It was initially designated as a conservation area and later a marine park. And as a result, the area is now out of bounds to local fishing and lobster catching. While the designations of conservation area and marine park might indicate concern over the natural resources, one of the real goals behind the designations was to attract tourists and tourist dollars to the area, in part by protecting a natural wonder that many of the tourists want to come visit. So this area that used to provide shelter and food for locals now provides a playground for foreign tourists who visit on day trips, as well as on private and rented sailboats that stay the night. There is some economic return to the local population, as local speedboats will sell ice and groceries to those on the sailboats and offer to take their trash for a fee. They also sell t-shirts and other trinkets, and there's a small network of industries that are supported by the sailing community, such as locally owned restaurants, taxi drivers, repair shops, etc. The photo on the right depicts local users. So these are the folks that are no longer allowed to fish in the park. Although it should be said, there are still many other fishing grounds available to them. The photo on the right shows the current conservation compatible use, the sailboats. Local fishing and harvesting has ended and has been replaced by novice sailors dropping anchors on sensitive reefs. And this is not a small population. There are commonly over 100 sailboats anchored in the Keys each day. There's also increased inputs of organic matter, as none of the boats use holding tanks for their latrines, and also diesel and oil from the dinghies. The sustainability of the local use of the resource versus the tourist use of the resource is certainly debatable. Both have impacts, but there was never any baseline data collected regarding the health of the reef prior to its designation as a conservation area or since. So while the intent may have been to protect the resource, in part to attract tourists, there's little evidence that this is in fact happening since there hasn't been any data collected. The effects of the designation as a park are unknown. Globalization has led to interest in faraway resources, and people not directly dependent on the resource now often consider themselves a stakeholder in that resource regardless. When discussing climate change and carbon sequestration, for example, deforestation in the Amazon used to be mentioned quite regularly and passionately among American and European environmentalists, often arousing strong feelings about what should or should not be done to manage this faraway resource. The Amazon was frequently referred to as the lungs of the planet and considered critical for the maintenance of a hospitable Earth. Similarly, the survival of megafauna in the African continent, so think about elephants and lions, rhinoceros, hippopotamus. These also arouse similar feelings of concern by people in faraway countries who may never actually visit Africa and who at the same time may be less concerned with the threatened and endangered species on their own continent. And these ones that are occurring on their own continent, they might actually directly affect, and so their actions could potentially change the course. This concern for far-off ecosystems stems in part from an increasing awareness that the world, and in particular the world's ecology, is all interconnected. Pollution in one part of the world will eventually disperse to other parts of the world, in most cases becoming more diluted in the process. There's also an attraction for exotic and sexy landscapes on the part of global cultures. Not having a holistic framework that sees people's lives and livelihoods as situated within the local landscape, affecting it and being affected by it, global cultures instead are attracted to far-off, exotic, and idealized natural landscapes that they imagine as pristine yet under threat, vulnerable and needing the protection of humans. That issues of concern in faraway landscapes are not also issues of concern when happening in one's own backyard is quite handy and at the same time a little bit suspect. So if you consider recent news, there's been a lot of concern, for example, for the killing of lions by big game hunters, for polar bears, for cheetahs, but there's not been nearly the level of concern locally for the Preble's jumping mouse, which is an endangered mouse along the Front Range of Colorado. Perhaps it stems from the belief that nature occurs where humans do not. So the lions in Africa, it's easy to imagine them, if you've never been to Africa, just being alone in the world without humans around, whereas we know that the Preble's mountain jumping mouse often occurs along irrigation ditches in land that's under agriculture, which is not what we typically think of as quite as natural. There's also perhaps the belief that tribal and indigenous peoples are somewhat less than human, and therefore still able to inhabit nature, which needs humans, the superhuman type, to protect it. Global cultures also place cultural significance on some parts of the globe over others, particularly places that arouse strong romantic notions of adventure and exoticism. Mount Everest, for example, as the tallest mountain in the world, holds special significance for many people in the world who live on different continents and may never even see it, particularly people in the global culture. It holds such significance for some that they're willing to travel across continents for significant sums of money to pick up trash on the approach to the summit. And it should be noted that much of the trash is left by members of global cultures who travel long distances and pay significant sums of money to attempt to summit Mount Everest, or at least to hike around its lower elevations. Global cultures even gave the mountain a global name, naming it after the foreign geographer Colonel Sir George Everest, rather than using one of the existing local names, which are Sagarmatha, or Head of the Sky, in Nepali, and Chomolungma, or Mother of the Universe in Tibetan. And there are differences in psychological approaches to the mountain as well. On the part of the locals, it might be reverence, subsistence, and the harvesting of foodstuffs and materials. And on the part of the global culture, it's often the idea of summiting, conquering, engaging in wild adventures. It should be noted that of the 680 pounds in this advertisement for a trip to Everest, to clean it up, very little will end up in Nepal. Most will go to advertising, office space, and staff in the United Kingdom. This is perhaps further evidence of resources being allocated along patterns of power. So in this case, those with power can generate significant economic activity by selling an experience in lands that are thousands of miles removed from them. This interest on the part of global cultures for certain charismatic parts of global ecology results in conflict between local, personal interests and values and animist beliefs and global, impersonal interests and values. The one is interested in providing for itself for today and tomorrow. The other is more interested in a command and control approach to resource use, or in providing an unspoiled playground to enjoy on vacation. Global cultures assume that local populations can't manage resources as they lack the proper education and understanding of the system. And as such, it's often thought that local populations threaten biodiversity. This harkens back to Victorian ideas of the backwardness of Indigenous peoples and their beliefs and understandings of the world around them. There are examples from around the world of global ecologists taking over the management of resources on the assumption that they'll have more understanding and do a better job than the local population has done. These assumptions are generally made without any evidence, just as we see in the example provided in Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo country. For global cultures, the perception that local populations are ignorant of ecology and threaten biodiversity is held so tightly that it's considered an absolute truth that doesn't need to be proven. The livestock reduction program on the Navajo Nation is just one example. Another comes from Baltistan, a mountainous region in northern Pakistan. So this quote comes from McDonald in 2004. Villagers in Hushi had been asked to stop subsistence hunting, and in return, the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, which is a large international conservation non-governmental organization, would arrange for wealthy foreign hunters to pay for the privilege of hunting on village lands. Villagers would then have access to some of the money generated through hunting. This use of international sport trophy hunting as a conservation as development initiative has been a key part of conservation planning around the world. As McDonald later notes, this project was planned in response to habitat degradation that was threatening the local ibex population, all of which was assumed as there had never been a survey of the local ibex population or the local vegetation. So whether ibex populations and or their habitat was in decline was entirely unknown. Time and again, the same processes have played out in different parts of the globe. Rich nations or non-governmental organizations impose their own ecological values on poor nations. Poor nations cannot safeguard their natural resources unless they can strengthen their economies. Planning and development of the local resources is done by foreigners or outsiders with little understanding of the local uses or needs of the resources, other than the general understanding that they are surely wrong and detrimental to the resource. Poor nations accept what's on offer. The aid granted in the form of expertise or funding invariably comes with directives attached over how the poor nation will develop, manage, or harvest the resource. This signifies a loss of autonomy that can undermine local knowledge and management. One of the more important functions of natural resources in Indian country is its role in the retention of Native American cultures, religions, and independence. To accomplish this, autonomous management from within an appropriate cultural context is necessary. These are the very things that are degraded when outsiders step in to help manage the natural resources. Natural resources and natural resource management play a fundamental role in Native American culture and religion. Native Americans' relationships with the land and its resource have shaped their cultures, religions, and traditions since time immemorial. Natural resources are an integral part of their rich heritage. Natural resource rights fulfill important spiritual and traditional roles that are vital to the retention of Native American cultures. Therefore, management must be understood from a cultural context which recognizes this important role of natural resources in Native American life. Indian land supports many of the common uses found in the rest of the United States, such as ranching, agriculture, mining, logging, timber production, fishing, hunting, recreation, tourism, and scientific study. These are important components of the tribal economy. Both the sale and consumption of products such as buffalo, beef, and timber, and the creation of paying jobs on reservations in managing the natural resources. In addition, the harvest of wild foodstuffs and craft materials play an important role in both the non-cash and cash economies upon which tribal members rely. The management of natural resources on tribal lands by tribal authorities to fulfill tribal goals is therefore an important component of tribal sovereignty, and this fact is fully recognized by tribal members and governments. Knowledge, natural resource management, and religion are so intertwined for many indigenous cultures that they may be one and the same thing. One of the clearest examples of the role cultural context has in defining management goals is that of traditional hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering. This is a quote from Theodoratus in 1998. "To most people, hunting and fishing is a sport. To the American Indian, it is a part of a religious custom. We did not believe in a church just one day. We believed in a church every day of the week and in every act that we did. And we have continued with that belief." For many tribes, hunting and fishing were the means of survival, and therefore, according to McCorkdale in 1997, they became the foundation of religion, culture, and tradition. Native people viewed their welfare as inextricably linked with the well-being of the natural world which sustained them. Tribes often insisted on the retention of fishing, gathering, trapping, and hunting rights when ceding lands to the U.S. government. So important were they to ensure the perpetuation of traditional practices in Indian culture. In his 1997 article, McCorkdale illustrated the significance of cultural context by comparing the management of recreational hunting from a globalized Western European American perspective with that of subsistence and ceremonial hunting. Recreational hunting in the United States is based on the premise that wildlife belongs to all citizens and that everyone has the right to hunt. Management ensures that each individual is given equal opportunity to partake in the sport. Because the prey base isn't large enough to support unlimited hunting by everyone, seasons are put into place to limit the amount of take, and bag limits are also often imposed to ensure a sustainable yield. Contrast that with Native American hunting, which is carried out for subsistence and ceremonial purposes, not for sport. The needs of the entire community have to be met, not the individual. So again, we see that preference of group good over individual good. Not everyone has the right to hunt in this context. Hunters make up only a select fraction of the community, and some hunters may hunt for those families who don't have a hunter, who are infirm, bereaved, or elderly. In this context, bag limits aren't appropriate. One family might not have a hunter, so they would have no use for bag limits, but they may be borrowing a hunter from another family and would like him to have their bag limits. Likewise, hunting seasons are inappropriate as traditional views oppose the stockpiling of game for future undefined uses, and the need for game are spread throughout the year and may occur unpredictably, as in the case of funerals, weddings, and with other special occasions. This doesn't mean necessarily that Indians will hunt and hunt more animals than can be supplied. They may just have different ways of limiting their hunting. This difference in management goals and tools has led to misunderstandings and feelings of animosity on the part of recreational hunters. The recreational hunters often assume that season length is a measure of tribal harvest impacts and therefore assume that tribes are taking more than their fair share. The imposition of Western hunting management practices on indigenous communities, on the other hand, usurps their sovereignty, inhibits cultural expression, and amounts to cultural imperialism. It's not hard to see many of the topics we've covered already play out in Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo country. There is the mainstream community perceiving the marginalized indigenous group as standing in the way of progress and as not being educated enough to manage their natural resources properly. Tribalism is seen as undermining nation states and standing in the way of progress. The primary reason that the United States government became involved in livestock reduction was out of concern for the well-being of the nation state and not concern for the reservation. There was concern that Hoover Dam, at the time Boulder Dam, and the reservoir would silt up and require dredging if overgrazing continued on the Navajo reservation, as it was assumed that improper grazing management by the Dene was resulting in increased erosion. Alternative theories of drought cycles and hydrology were also presented, but these were dismissed. It was a given that tribals could not manage resources appropriately, and the remedy was mainstream range management prescriptions crafted by outsiders for the Dene. Compliance would be mandatory and enforced for the good of the Dene community and the good of the United States. Although this happened in the early part of the 20th century, we can see the ideology prominent in the Victorian era of certain more advanced cultures showing the less advanced, by force if necessary, the way to enlightenment. Implicit in the imposition of Western ecological principles and range management prescriptions on the Dene is the paternal nature of the Indian-European-American relationship. Out of concern for their natural resources, the US government steps in and assumes authority. The Western land managers also assumed that communal grazing on the part of the Dene was unregulated, unmanaged, and naturally would lead to the degradation of the resource. Dubbed the tragedy of the commons, the premise is that when individual actors, acting on their own self-interest, share a resource such as grazing land, each actor will use more and more of the resource until it is depleted. In the case of the Dene in sheep grazing, the rationale is that each sheep herder is motivated to seek the best individual return possible. Suppose 20 herders share a rangeland and each one has 100 animals on the range for a total of 2,000 animals. Suppose further that at this stocking density, there's just enough forage for each animal to reach a maximum weight and for the vegetation to continue to produce sustainably. If one herder adds 10 more animals to his flock, all of the animals will weigh slightly less at the end of the season. However, the slight downturn in animal condition is distributed amongst the entire herd, which would now be 2,010 animals, and perhaps only offsets their optimal weight by a few grams. The one herder who added 10 animals still increases his return, gaining all of the added benefit for himself, while the cost of this increase is spread out amongst all the herders. This is the idea behind the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons has a long history of being ascribed by global cultures to local cultures. In fact, local cultures in most cases are not treating the resource as a free-for-all. They generally have institutions in place that regulate their communal use of the resource to avoid a tragedy of the commons. These institutions, however, are often invisible to outsiders. They're usually not encoded in ways that global cultures understand. For example, in written documents and in signage, with an administrative hierarchy to enforce them. Instead, they're captured in the social relationships that bind members to each other in local communities. Not being able to recognize or see these institutions, global cultures assume that they don't exist. The federal government has traditionally provided most of the services on many reservations. These include things like healthcare, primary and secondary education, and the management and sale of natural resources. These services were provided and managed as they were for the mainstream population of the United States and provided no opportunities for self-determination or sovereignty on the part of the tribal population. In many cases, they were not culturally appropriate, and in fact, many were not appropriate given the rural nature of most tribes. And the reason that the federal government provides these services on reservations has to do with the treaties. When they formed treaties with the local indigenous people, this was what they said they would do. You'll cede your lands for these areas and we'll provide services on reservations. So it's a result of the treaties. In 1970, Richard Nixon spoke to Congress of the need to strengthen the Indian sense of autonomy without threatening his sense of community. In 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed to meet these ends. According to Stewart in 1990, the passing of the act, Congress stated its finding that federal domination of Indian affairs had deprived American Indians of leadership skills and had denied Indians an effective voice in planning and implementing programs. The act created a process through which a tribe may contract with the federal government to provide the social services granted them through treaty making. The tribal service providers remain under the authority of the federal agency they have contracted with. So to some degree, the tribe can tailor the goods and services to reflect their cultural values, resulting in services that are more effective and better address the needs of the tribe. However, the service provider must also follow guidelines set forth by the contracting agency, so that would be a federal agency, on appropriate management. The Indian Child Welfare Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act both passed in 1978, and these are further examples of the federal government's recognition and support of tribal sovereignty in more recent times. In order to take advantage of the 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, tribes need members with professional qualifications as defined by the U.S. government, and to have an understanding of the bureaucratic process in order to successfully contract with the federal government and assist their own communities by providing goods and services. In essence, the tribes must subscribe to the mainstream education and administrative paradigms in order to participate in contracting. In addition, ideas of Indian authority and property ownership aren't recognized by the Act, and this leads to conflicts in administrative styles. To successfully contract, tribes must demonstrate that they have qualified managers to take over positions that are currently held by federal government agents. Although the number of college-educated Indians is increasing, many Native American communities must still rely on people of other cultures to teach in their schools, manage their natural resources, and provide their health care. This dependency on outsiders, who have historically not had their best interests at heart and may not understand or respect their values, detracts from the sense of empowerment and sovereignty that can otherwise emerge from contracting. In addition, this can increase costs for tribes. Non-Native outsiders tend to require a higher salary than a tribal member who wants to remain on the reservation. This ties into the next constraint, funding the Act. When the Act was first passed, tribes were awarded funding for a contract based on how much it would cost the federal government to provide that service. The federal government was usually more efficient at providing services as they were centralized, and some services were shared by many different offices, reducing the costs by providing those services in bulk. Tribes struggled to provide services on the same budget when they lacked the infrastructure to support their mission that the federal government had. Amendments to the Act in 1988 and 1994 allowed tribes to also receive project support costs in addition to the base program amounts. These could be things such as indirect costs like accounting, direct costs such as trainings, and/or startup costs such as the purchase of computers. Appropriations from Congress for this program have not been sufficient to cover the support costs, and tribes have made do by reducing their indirect costs, using tribal resources, or forgoing contracting altogether. Initially, contracting was rife with federally imposed conditions and regulations that severely constrained tribal choices, as well as the success of even being granted a contract. Several amendments to the Act have streamlined the contracting process and reduced the amount of explicit conditions and regulations that tribes must follow. So it's a little bit easier today to contract under this Act.